Who raised you more? Your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
Here is the part one have not said out loud to anyone because the moment I start it feels childish and petty, and I hate how small it makes me sound, yet it is the hinge on which the whole thing swung. Because at noon on a Thursday my sister Emily sent me a message that read, word for word, that only the successful were going on the family cruise and she hoped I understood. And I sat there with my phone in my hand and the kind of laugh that is not a laugh in my throat, because I did understand. I understood perfectly. I understood that she wanted me to read it, sit with it, and either defend myself or collapse into silence so she could feel taller, and I chose silence, but not the kind that means surrender. The kind that means I will not be performing for you today. If you have grown up in a family where points are awarded for the right job titles and the right photos and the right vacations that prove you are living the right life, then you know the scoreboard I am talking about, and you know how the rules are vague on purpose. Because vague rules let the person who benefits from them pretend they are objective, and in our family Emily had been the self-appointed referee since college, which is funny in the sad way because she did not invent any companies, or write any books or cure anything. She just told better stories about what she did, and early on I decided it was not worth the effort to keep up with her narration. Which meant that as the years passed the legend of Emily grew while I kept my head down and did my work and let people think whatever made their days easier, and this was fine until it wasn't. I wish I could say the message surprised me, but it didn't. It only clarified what had been floated for months as jokes. Little lines like maybe next time you can come if you hit your goals, or you know it's a big expense and we want to keep it tight. And I kept letting them roll by because I was busy, because I had signed a thick stack of documents promising to keep my mouth shut about a deal that might change the shape of my life, because I was tired of being measured by people who never looked at the ruler they were using, and because there is a part of me that finds arguing about status boring in the most soul-killing way. Still, I am not made of stone, and after I read her message, I put the phone face down and I sat there and let the heat move through me. Not the theatrical kind of anger that needs an audience, but the practical kind that makes your thoughts click into clean rows. Because I remembered the times I stepped in quietly and paid for things that kept the family machine running, not because I was a martyr, but because it was easier, the streaming accounts and the shared cloud storage I set up and the international phone plan add-on I attached to Mom's line after she got stranded once, and how nobody asked whose credit card was on file as long as everything worked, and it hit me that my mistake was not paying. It was paying while letting them act like I was the one being carried. I did not reply to Emily, not a single word, and I did not send a screenshot to a friend to win sympathy, and I did not post anything coy online, because I did not need an audience, I needed a boundary. So I opened my laptop and I went into the accounts where my name sat quietly behind the curtain, and I started cleaning house, not with the mean spirit of sabotage, but with the clear logic that if I was too unsuccessful to be included in their fun, then I was certainly too unsuccessful to be the invisible infrastructure that made their lives convenient. So I removed my card from the family streaming bundle. I exported and archived the shared photo library I had been paying to expand every year. And I turned off the international roaming add-on that I had set to auto-renew for my parents, leaving their basic plan untouched because I am not cruel, but also leaving them responsible for anything extra they decided to do while sailing around taking victory photos. Before you call that petty, let me tell you how it felt, because it did not feel like payback. It felt like alignment, like finally matching how they spoke about me with how I participated in their lives. And once the practical steps were done, the anger dimmed to something almost quiet, and in that quiet I saw clearly why Emily's message landed so hard, because it was not about a boat or a trip, it was about permission, who gets to decide who counts, and why I ever let her think she had the keys. I made myself a promise in that moment, and I wrote it in my notes so I could not wiggle out of it later, that I would not explain, I would not pre-defend, I would not soften it with a joke. I would let people believe whatever they needed to believe until the facts of my life showed up on their own, and the reason I could make that promise without shaking was simple, because tucked under the lid of my days was something big enough to bend the light around it. A merger I had been building piece by peace with a team that did not care about family scoreboards, and it was close. So close that the calendar made my stomach flip whenever I looked at it, and all I had to do was keep my mouth shut and do my job. I picked up my phone again, not to answer Emily, but to mute the family chat for a week, because there is a particular kind of peace that comes from stepping out of a room where people confuse kindness with weakness. And as I hit mute, I felt the smallest smile in my chest, not the gloating kind, the steady kind, because for the first time in a long time I was not trying to win their game, I was ending my participation, and the funny part. The part that would make me laugh later was that I did not need to plan any dramatic reveal or write a speech or do anything performative at all, because events were moving on a track that did not require my showmanship. And if you are wondering whether I left even a single breadcrumb, here is your answer, and it is the closest thing to revenge I allowed myself that day. I opened the family subscription portal where my name had been the quiet backbone, and I clicked remove on every slot where I was the guarantor. Then I closed the tab, and I put the laptop away, because if I was not successful enough to sit at their table, then they could eat without my card on it, and I slept like a person who has finally stopped explaining herself. The thing about my family, and I mean the entire extended version of it, not just the branch I deal with on a weekly basis, is that there has always been this unspoken but constantly enforced ranking system. Almost like some invisible scoreboard everyone can see except no one will admit exists, and the points are never given for kindness, loyalty, or the ability to show up when someone is sick or in trouble. They are handed out for things that look good on the outside and make for the kind of stories you can brag about at barbecues or post about online without it looking like bragging, which means in our family there is this unwritten list of who is worth more and who sits at the bottom pretending not to care. From as far back as I can remember, Emily has been obsessed with being at the top of that scoreboard, and she's not subtle about it. She finds ways to drop her achievements into conversations, and if she doesn't have one of her own to parade around, she'll find a way to diminish someone else's so the balance still tips in her favor. For years, I let it slide because I had more important things to do than win at a game I didn't even agree to play. But the problem with staying out of the competition is that the people who are playing still rank you, and they fill in the blanks about your life in whatever way benefits them. Emily knew almost nothing about the actual details of my work or my finances because I kept it that way deliberately, not out of shame or secrecy in a dark sense, but because I'd learned a long time ago that giving her any concrete information was like handing her a knife she could either wave around to impress people or stick in your back when it suited her. So, from her perspective, and from the perspective of anyone who believed her version of me, I was stable enough, but not exceptional, not in a way that met the family's definition of success, which was basically, if they wouldn't put you on a pedestal at a neighborhood dinner, you didn't count. The cruise, of course, was not really about the cruise. It was about cementing who was in and who was out that year. And make no mistake, my family operates on an annual reset. You can be in one year and out the next depending on whether you've hit some milestone they care about. Births, big promotions, expensive vacations, public recognition, all of that gets you points. Keeping your head down, making smart but quiet moves, or working on something big that no one can know about yet. That earns you nothing. And so I became the safe exclusion, the one they could cut without any blowback because, on paper, they could pretend I just wasn't free or probably wouldn't enjoy it, when the truth was they wanted to make a point about who belonged in the highlight reel. When Emily sent that message about only the successful are going, it wasn't some slip of the tongue or a moment of unfiltered honesty. It was deliberate, calculated, and designed to be a final word in a conversation I wasn't even having. She wanted me to feel small, to sit at home imagining them laughing, and to somehow make that sting enough that I would try harder next year. What she didn't know was that I had already stopped auditioning for their approval a long time ago. And while I won't pretend it didn't bother me, because being dismissed by your own family will always bother you on some level, I also knew something she didn't, which was that in a matter of weeks, there would be an announcement she couldn't spin, ignore, or diminish without making herself look ridiculous. The thing is, there's a particular satisfaction in knowing you have the upper hand and choosing not to show it right away. I could have sent her a vague, smug reply hinting at what was coming. I could have dropped breadcrumbs in the family group chat just to stir curiosity. But why waste the moment? If there's anything I've learned, it's that silence can be louder than any threat when you have the patience to wait it out. So I said nothing, and I let her and the rest of them take that cruise with the assumption that they were leaving the less successful one behind, blissfully unaware that the scoreboard they were so proud of was about to be rewritten without their permission. 2 days before they were set to leave, someone in the family group sent a photo of the suitcases all lined up in the hallway, ready to go. Emily added a caption about how we've earned this and tagged half the family. Normally, I'd roll my eyes and ignore it, but this time, I looked at that picture and instead of feeling any sort of envy or bitterness, I felt this strange wave of calm amusement. Because while they were busy packing for a trip to make themselves feel important, I was in the middle of finalizing a deal that would not just put me on a bigger map professionally, but also lock in a level of stability and independence that no family cruise or vacation photo could ever compete with. So I decided to let them have their moment. I didn't correct the narrative, I didn't hint at my own news, and I didn't send any passive-aggressive parting shots. I kept my head down, went to work, and focused on making sure every last detail of the merger was locked in tight, because I knew, absolutely knew, that when the moment came, I wouldn't have to say a word. The announcement would do it for me. And the best part was, they'd never see it coming. If there is one part of this whole story that I wish I could hand you like a card pulled from a stack, so you could see it clearly without the noise, it would be the stretch of weeks where everything important was happening in rooms where phones stayed face down and doors clicked quietly behind you, because that was where the merger lived. Not in the glossy press release that would later carry tidy quotes and a clean dollar figure, but in the slow, steady grind of aligning two companies that had every reason to be suspicious of each other and yet also every reason to recognize that together they could do something neither could do alone, which meant my days were this careful choreography of drafting language that would survive lawyers, sitting with finance models until the rows stopped swimming, and coaching product folks to talk about roadmaps without giving away trade secrets. And while that sounds cold and corporate when I say it out loud, what it really felt like to me was building a life raft big enough for the people who had trusted me long before there was any press to chase. We worked under those agreements that make you sign your name so many times your hand hurts, the kind of documents that do not just tell you to keep your mouth shut, but make you personally liable if you don't. And that level of responsibility has a way of making you care less about gossip and more about execution. So when my family's little scoreboard conversation flared up, I treated it like background static. Because the stakes in front of me were real and measurable, jobs and careers and reputations that would either hold together or come apart depending on how well we kept our promises. And if there is a single thread that runs through my choices in this period, it is this: I chose the work and I let the work speak for me. It did not mean there was no emotion, because there was plenty, especially at night when the meetings stopped and the adrenaline wore off and I would catch myself wondering if I was being naive to keep believing that competence would eventually cut through the noise. And in those moments I could hear Emily's message in my head like a bad ringtone: only the successful are going, which is such a ridiculous sentence when you say it slowly, as if success were a boarding pass handed out by a gate agent with a grudge, and every time that line tried to take up space, I answered it the same way, by opening a new draft, tightening another paragraph, or calling a person who needed reassurance that we were still on track. Because every hour I invested in the deal was a quiet no to the part of me that wanted to run laps in the arena of family opinion. There was one meeting that sticks with me not because of anything cinematic, but because of a single decision that turned out to be my only deliberate act of payback in this entire arc, if you can even call it that. And it was when the communications team asked who should be on camera for the first interview once the announcement went live, and a list of names came up that were safe and expected, people who would say the right lines with the right smile. And I felt this calm certainty that after months of carrying the unglamorous pieces, I would not hand away the part where the public finally understood the shape of what we had done. So I spoke up and I said I would take it, not in a look-at-me way, but in a direct, grounded way that left no room for anyone to pretend I had not earned the seat. And after a beat, the head of comms nodded and said, "Good, that will be stronger," and my name went on the sheet that would go to the producer. The day the final board votes landed, I was too tired to celebrate and too wired to sleep, which meant I did what I always do when my brain needs a simple task that still feels like a choice. I ordered a large pizza. Because the ritual of it marks the end of pushing and the start of letting things unfold, and I ate 2 slices at the counter while reading the internal memo that confirmed the last signatures and set the clock for the public window, and I will be honest with you, I did think about sending a single sentence to the family chat, something bland like "hope the cruise is fun," but I closed the app instead, because if I have learned anything it is that a clean silence can be its own kind of statement when you are holding a card no one knows you have. That weekend I told myself I would do nothing, no errands, no networking, no checking in on anyone's opinion of anything, just a hard reset before the announcement, and I actually kept that promise for a full day, which is an achievement in its own right. Until a former colleague whose radar is always too good for comfort texted me a line that made my stomach flip even though it was only a handful of words stripped of context. She wrote that tonight is going to be interesting, and then she put her phone on Do Not Disturb like a tease, and I stared at that screen feeling the edge of something approaching even though the official timing said we were still a few days out. And for the first time since Emily's message, I felt genuine curiosity about how the news would reach the people who had drawn their little line between the successful and the rest, because I had not engineered any reveal. I had not sent so much as a hint. And yet there it was, a signal that the world beyond our plan was already moving, and I realized with a kind of quiet thrill that whatever happened next would not be orchestrated by me. It would just happen, and they would have to watch it like everyone else. There are moments in life when you think you are prepared for how they will feel because you have run them through your mind enough times to believe you have rehearsed every beat, yet when they actually arrive, they have this entirely different weight. A kind of pressure that builds quietly in your chest, and the night of the broadcast was exactly that for me, because I had spent months living inside the details of this merger, seeing every spreadsheet, every draft, every negotiation note, and I thought I would watch the announcement with a kind of clinical detachment, nodding at the accuracy of the wording and maybe making a mental note about which quotes I liked, but the reality was that as soon as the segment started and I saw my own face on that screen, positioned next to the CEO, speaking with the confidence I had fought for through every late-night meeting and every quiet decision to hold my ground, I felt this mix of vindication and disbelief that was sharper than anything I had imagined. It started as just background noise while I was sitting at my kitchen counter with a slice of leftover pizza in one hand, because I had told myself I was going to watch it casually, as if it were just another industry update. But the moment they cut to my portion of the interview, the tone in the room shifted for me entirely, because there was my name, my title, and the figure of the deal in words that would land in living rooms across the country, and it hit me in this layered way, not just as the professional acknowledgement it was, but as the absolute destruction of the narrative my family had been running with for years, the quiet erasure of me as someone who was just getting by. This wasn't a rumor I could start. This wasn't a social media post I could frame however I wanted. This was a national news segment, time-stamped, archived, and distributed far beyond any circle my sister could influence. I didn't move much during the whole thing, partly because I didn't want to distract myself from taking in every word, and partly because I knew there was something satisfying about being still in that moment, letting the reality of it settle without rushing to react. The segment wasn't long, maybe a few minutes, but it was tight and clean and left no room for interpretation. I was central to a multi-million-dollar deal between 2 companies whose names carried weight even outside of our industry. And I spoke as someone who clearly belonged at that table. There was no way to spin that into luck or coincidence, no way to pretend it wasn't the result of years of work that had finally crossed into the kind of visibility you can't ignore. When it ended, I muted the TV and just sat there in the quiet, because there's something to be said for letting a victory breathe before you do anything with it. I could have grabbed my phone right then and posted a link, tagged the company, written something humble brag adjacent to make sure it landed in the feeds of anyone who might miss the live segment. But the thought of doing that felt small compared to the pleasure of knowing it would travel without me lifting a finger. I knew the clip would circulate, that people would share it in group chats, that colleagues would send it to their networks, and eventually, Inevitably, it would make its way into the family chat where I had been muted for over a week. The power in that was not in the announcement itself, but in the fact that I had done nothing to deliver it directly to them. As I sat there, I realized that the best part of the entire thing was that my sister and the rest of them would see it in the exact same way strangers did, stripped of any context they could control, unable to filter it through the familiar dismissals or minimizing comments they usually used. They would hear the anchor read my name and credentials, watch the footage of me shaking hands with executives, and hear my voice discussing the future of the merged company in the same breath as words like growth, expansion, and leadership. They would have to process that without me feeding them a story, which meant they could only react, not reshape. I went to bed not with adrenaline, but with the kind of calm you get when you've crossed the finish line on something you know will hold its own without your interference. I didn't check my phone, I didn't scroll through any mentions, and I didn't try to measure the reach of the segment. I just let it sit there, knowing that somewhere out there, people who had written me off, including the ones related to me by blood, were now faced with an undeniable fact about who I was and what I had accomplished. And for once, I wasn't going to give them the comfort of a direct conversation to help them manage it. By the time I turned off the light, the only thought I allowed myself was how interesting it would be to see how long it took before the messages started, because I knew they would come, and I knew they would be dressed up as pride, excitement, and support. But behind every single one of them would be the quiet acknowledgement that the scoreboard they had clung to so tightly was useless now. I didn't need to say a word. The broadcast had already done the work. I woke up to the kind of phone that looks like it is trying to escape your hand, the screen full of missed calls, stacked notifications, and those preview bubbles that show just enough of a message to tell you someone has decided to become your biggest fan overnight. And for a minute, I just watched them roll in because there is a strange pleasure in not reacting right away, in letting the chorus sing without a conductor, and as I scrolled I saw the familiar names, the cousins who are usually neutral until there's something to celebrate, the aunts who love a public success story like a holiday, and then, threaded through all of it like a ribbon you can't miss, message after message from Emily, each one a new costume change, first breezy and congratulatory, then breathless and proud, then suddenly vulnerable about how she never meant to exclude me and must have worded it badly, as if the sentence I had memorized by heart had been an autocorrect mistake that just happened to sound like a thesis statement. I made coffee and stared at the wall for a long minute because I wanted to decide who I was going to be that morning, not react out of adrenaline and not play the generous winner too quickly, and while I stood there I remembered the hours of work, the clauses I fought for, the quiet calls where I talked people down from panic, and I realized that if the entire point of this turn in my life was to stop negotiating my worth in rooms that did not deserve me, then the first test was here in my kitchen, with my phone lighting up like a slot machine. So I sat down and, before answering anyone, I listened to Emily's longest voice note in full, the one where she tried every angle she had, nostalgia, family duty, sisterhood, and then, when those didn't land even in her own voice, an offer to plan something special together soon, so we could both show up as our best selves, which was her way of saying she wanted a photo with me on her terms, so she could attach my win to her story and cash it in later. I did not respond to her first, because a boundary is not a performance, it is a sequence, so I opened the thread from my parents and read their messages twice, both of them overflowing with pride and also this undertone of confusion at the timing, because the world had learned something big about their daughter at the same moment they were comparing dinner seating on a boat I was not welcome on, and I answered them plainly and warmly, that I loved them and that I was happy, that the work was real and the people who helped me get here deserved the credit alongside me, and that I would come by after they were home to hug them and tell them the parts one could tell, and then I added one clean sentence that mattered more than anything I wrote that day. That going forward I would not participate in gatherings where anyone's worth was graded in secret or out loud, and that if I had to choose between peace and proximity, I would choose peace, which landed, because my mother sent a short reply. That felt like a deep exhale, and my father, who hates long threads, wrote that he understood. Then I opened the family chat I had muted and I unmuted it because I wanted to hear the room without being dragged into it, and I watched the clip of the broadcast that someone had already forwarded. And I read the little comments of surprise and recalibration, and right there, without drama, I dropped in a single message that I wrote slowly so I wouldn't water it down. I wrote that I appreciated the kind words, that I was focused on the work and my team. And that is a housekeeping note I had. Removed my cards from the shared services the previous week, so if anything stopped working, people would need to add their own payment methods, and I ended the message with a thank you and a wish that everyone enjoyed their trip, which may sound small. But it was the exact size of the power I wanted to hold, not vindictive, not begging, just exact, and when I hit send I felt the whole tenor of the chat tilt, because I had said the quiet part out loud in a tone no one could attack without revealing themselves. Only then did I respond to Emily, and I did not scold. I did not match her performance with my own. I sent her back her original sentence as a screenshot, "Only the successful are going." And underneath it I wrote that I had heard her message clearly the first time and I had adjusted my participation accordingly, that I wished her well, and that if she ever wanted a real conversation that did not involve a scoreboard, I'd be open to it after an apology to me and also to our parents for putting them in the middle, and I ended with a line that was simple but final, that I would not be available for any plan that required me to audition for a seat, because that era in my life had ended, which is not a threat but a closure, and closures, when done right, are often the sharpest justice you can deliver. After that, I allowed myself one public thing, because I wanted the energy I was carrying to move forward instead of circling around the same old family theater, so I posted a short thank you note to my team on a professional platform, no dollar figures, no flex, just gratitude and a hiring note for roles we were opening, and then I made a private decision that tasted better than any trophy. I set aside a small fund in my budget for the next year to help 2 younger cousins with certifications and tuition quietly through their parents with no strings and no announcements, because if I am going to have a definition of success in this family, it is going to be about building capacity for people who show up, not about vacation photos that prove temporary status, and choosing that, deliberately and without fanfare, felt like my kind of revenge, the kind that changes what the room values even if the room takes a while to realize it. The final move, the one that settled everything inside me, was the easiest, when Emily wrote again an hour later asking if we could plan a celebratory dinner as a family when they returned. I told her I wouldn't be available that weekend because I had plans with the people who had held me up when nothing was public and the nights were long, and that if there was ever a gathering where no one needed to posture to feel safe, she could send an invite and I would consider it, and then I put my phone down and went back to work, because the truest revenge is not a clapback or a spectacle. It is living precisely the way they tried to convince you couldn't, and doing it so cleanly that the only role left for them is to sit with the echo of their own words. Which, in this case, is a sentence I will never forget, not because it hurt, but because it turned out to be the line that finally freed me.